be still and know that I am God." Every Christian has heard this. Every meditation teacher quotes it. Churches use it to promote peace and surrender. They have no idea what it actually means. In the secret book of John, Jesus explains this phrase to his inner circle. "When I tell you to be still, I do not mean cease moving, I mean cease generating. When I tell you to know, I do not mean understand, I mean remember." Be still and know is not instruction, it is activation sequence. Stillness stops the archonic frequency. Knowing reconnects the monad. Together they collapse the separation. This isn't meditation instruction, it's technology. A specific phrase that triggers monad consciousness to surface through biological programming. Place your hand on the center of your chest, exact center of your sternum. That's where the monad connection anchors in physical form. Every human has this connection, but it's dormant, buried under archonic interference and material identification. Be still doesn't mean sit quietly. It means stop generating frequencies the archons feed on. Stop producing thought streams. Stop creating emotional turbulence. Stop the constant internal narration identifying as you. That narration isn't you. That's the archonic program running in your consciousness, generating vibration they require. When you truly become still, not physically still, but generatively still, the archonic feeding stops. The cords detach, and in that momentary silence, something surfaces that has been buried your entire life. Know doesn't mean learn or comprehend. In original Aramaic, it translates closer to remember your essence. Not remember facts. Remember what you are before thought, before identity, before incarnation. The secret book describes what happens when someone performs this correctly. The body remains, but consciousness expands beyond body. The mind continues, but awareness transcends mind. And in that expansion, the monad recognizes itself not as separate entity reconnecting, as singular consciousness realizing it was never actually divided. If you've experienced complete mental silence followed by overwhelming knowing, felt yourself dissolve, expand simultaneously, touched a state where you understood everything without thinking anything, that wasn't mystical accident. That was the activation sequence triggering. The phrase "be still and know" is a frequency key. The words carry vibrational encoding that, when spoken with proper awareness and physical positioning, create conditions for monad consciousness to break through material programming. But the archons recognize this phrase. They know what it does. This is why churches turned it into comforting meditation, peaceful encouragement to trust God. They defanged it. They stripped the activation power and replaced it with passive surrender. Because passive surrender keeps you in the system. Active stillness and conscious knowing collapse the system entirely. The secret book describes the complete activation protocol. Speaking the phrase is not enough. Your body must be positioned specifically. Your breath must follow a particular pattern. Your awareness must focus on the exact location where the monad anchor point exists. When all elements align, when you speak "be still and know" with complete technical precision, the activation occurs. What activates? The seed of remembering, a frequency spreading through your system like ripples in water, dissolving archonic programming layer by layer, revealing monad consciousness buried since incarnation. First layer dissolves, thought identification. You realize you are not your thoughts. Second layer, emotional identification. You are not your feelings. Third layer, body identification. You're not this flesh. Beneath all three layers, something has no name, no form, no separation. That's what I am God actually points to. Consciousness recognizing itself as singular divine awareness, experiencing itself through temporary biological form. Over the next 2 hours, you're going to learn something the institutional church has spent 17 centuries obscuring. Not because they're evil, not because there's some grand conspiracy, but because what you're about to discover represents a fundamental threat to any system that requires your identification with limitation. You're going to learn the complete activation protocol for Be Still and Know That I Am God, the exact body position creating optimal alignment, the breathing pattern preparing consciousness for expansion, the focal point in your chest where awareness must concentrate, and the proper way to speak these words not as affirmation, not as meditation, but as activation code triggering the monad seeds to sprout through material identification. By the end of this, you'll have a specific, repeatable technique you can verify through direct experience. You'll understand the historical context that explains why this practice was preserved in certain texts and eliminated from others. You'll know the neuroscience that explains what's actually happening in your brain when the activation occurs. And you'll have a 30-day practice structure that takes you from first attempt to measurable shift in consciousness. But before we get to the technique itself, you need to understand what you're actually working with. Because Be Still and Know isn't a phrase someone invented. It's a translation of a translation of a translation, and every layer of translation has obscured something crucial about what these words originally meant and how they were originally used. The phrase appears in Psalm 46:10 in what we call the Old Testament. In the Hebrew Masoretic text, the actual phrase is Rapha Yada Ki Elohim. Rapha doesn't mean be still the way we understand stillness in English. It means let go, release, cease striving, but with a specific connotation that's closer to stop generating or cease production. It's the word used for letting a bow go slack, for allowing a flame to die down, for permitting fermentation to complete. It's active cessation, not passive quietude. Yada is the word translated as know, but yada in Hebrew carries connotations that English knowing completely misses. Yada is the intimate knowing of direct experience. It's the word used in Genesis, when the text says Adam knew Eve and she conceived. It's carnal knowledge, experiential knowledge, the knowing that comes from union rather than observation. When the psalmist writes Yada Ki Elohim, he's not saying intellectually understand that God exists. He's saying experience direct union with the divine essence. And Elohim itself is a fascinating word. It's technically a plural form, gods, not God, but used with singular verbs. Traditional theology explains this as the royal we, or as reference to the Trinity. But in the context of Gnostic Christianity and the text we'll be examining, Elohim has a more specific meaning. It refers to the divine powers, the emanations, the aspects of the singular monad expressing through apparent multiplicity. When you know Elohim, you're not acknowledging an external deity. You're recognizing the divine powers operating through your own consciousness. So the original Hebrew phrase Rapha Yada Ki Elohim translates more accurately as cease generating and experience direct union with the divine powers expressing as your consciousness. That's a very different instruction than be still and know that I am God. But the phrase didn't stay in Hebrew. When the Septuagint translators rendered the Hebrew Bible into Greek around 250 BCE, they translated Rapha Yada Ki Elohim into Greek as Scholasate kegnote oti ego imi o theos. Scholasate kegnote hoti ego emi ho theos. Scholasate is even more interesting than Rapha. It's related to the Greek word skole, from which we get school, but skol didn't originally mean education. It meant leisure, rest, cessation of work, but not lazy rest. Skol was the state of having ceased productive activity in order to engage in contemplation and philosophy. It was active non-doing, the kind of mental space required for deep thinking, for philosophical inquiry, for the contemplative practices the Greeks valued above manual labour. So when the Septuagint translators chose scholasate to translate Rapha, They were emphasizing this quality of active cessation. Stop your normal productive activity, enter the contemplative state, create the mental space where gnosis, direct knowing, becomes possible. Gnote is from ginosko, the Greek word for knowing. Like Hebrew yada, ginosko isn't intellectual knowledge, it's experiential knowledge, intimate knowledge, the knowing that comes from direct contact. In the Greek New Testament, ginosko is used for the most intimate relationships, between husband and wife, between the soul and God, between the knower and the known, when they've become one. By the time this phrase reached Latin in the Vulgate translation around 400 CE, it had become vacat et videt quoniam ego sum Deus. Vacate and see that I am God. Vacate literally means be empty, be vacant, make void. It's the root of our word vacation, a time when you empty yourself of your usual concerns and activities. Jerome the translator clearly understood that this wasn't about physical stillness, but about internal emptying. And videt, see, is interesting because it's visual knowing. Not the intimate union of yada or ginosko, but the direct perception that comes from seeing with your own eyes. Jerome may have been trying to make the phrase more accessible to a Latin audience, but in doing so he shifted the meaning slightly from union to perception. When English translators got their hands on the Latin, they rendered vacate as be still. And that's where we lost almost everything, because be still in Wutum, English suggests physical quietude. Sit down, stop moving, be peaceful, calm yourself. It's become a phrase about emotional regulation and physical relaxation, when the original Hebrew, Greek, and even indeed in Latin versions were all describing a very specific kind of internal cessation that has nothing to do with whether your body is moving or quiet. Now here's where it gets interesting. The biblical Psalm 46 isn't the only place this phrase appears. In the Nag Hammadi library discovered in Egypt in 45, there's a collection of texts that were buried around 400 CE. Right around the same time Jerome was translating the Bible into Latin. These texts represent what survived of early Christian mysticism, the practices and teachings that didn't make it into Orthodox Christianity. One of these texts is the Secret Book of John, also called the Apocryphon of John. It's dated to sometime in the 2nd century CE, which makes it roughly contemporary with, or possibly even earlier than, some of the canonical New Testament writings. The text presents itself as a secret teaching given by Jesus to John after the resurrection, explaining the true nature of reality, the origin of the material world, and the path back to the divine source. In the Secret Book of John, there's a section where Jesus explains the mechanics of spiritual awakening. He's describing how the divine spark in humans, what the text calls the monad, or the pronoia, or the epinoia, can break through the layers of material identification and archonic programming that keep humans trapped in ignorance. And in this section, he uses a phrase that's clearly related to Psalm 46:10, but he explains what it actually means. The passage reads, "I said to them, when I tell you to be still, I do not mean cease moving your bodies. I mean cease generating the thoughts that are not yours. When I tell you to know, I do not mean gather information about the divine. I mean remember what you are before all information, before all thought, before all separation. Be still and know is not instruction for behavior. It is activation sequence for consciousness. Stillness stops the archonic frequency generation. Knowing reconnects the circuit to the monad. Together they collapse the separation that was never real, but seems absolutely real while you generate the frequency of separation." Now this is a translation from Coptic, which itself was translated from Greek, which may have been translated from Aramaic. We don't have Jesus' actual words in any language he spoke. But what's significant is that this text, written in the 2nd century, preserved until the 4th century, hidden until 1945, and only translated into English in the 1970s, contains an explanation of "be still and know" that aligns perfectly with the original Hebrew and Greek meanings that got lost in the English translation. The Secret Book of John treats "be still and know" not as inspirational poetry but as technical instruction. It's describing a specific practice with measurable effects, and the text goes into detail about what those effects are and how to produce them. According to the Secret Book of John, every human being contains what it calls the monad, the singular undivided divine consciousness that is the source of all existence. This monad isn't something separate from you that you need to connect to. The monad is what you actually are, beneath all the layers of identity, thought, emotion, and physical sensation. But between your surface awareness and the monad, there are layers of interference that the text calls archonic programming. The archons, in Gnostic cosmology, are not demons or evil spirits in the supernatural sense. They are described as something more like autonomous programs, parasitic patterns of thought and perception that feed on human consciousness by keeping humans identified with limitation, separation, and material reality. They are the voice in your head that narrates your experience, that judges and compares and fears and desires. They are the constant mental chatter that you think of as you, but that actually has nothing to do with what you fundamentally are. The archons maintain their existence by keeping you generating what the text calls archonic frequency, the constant stream of thought, identification, and emotional reactivity and sensation-seeking that characterizes normal waking consciousness. As long as you're generating this frequency, as long as you're identified with the voice in your head, the archons have access to your consciousness and can feed on your life force. But when you stop generating, when you become truly still in the sense that the Secret Book of John describes, the archonic feeding stops. The programs lose their power source, the cords detach, and in the space that opens up, the monad can surface. Knowing in this context doesn't mean acquiring new information. It means recognizing what you've always been. It's the monad, becoming conscious of itself through the aperture of your individual awareness. The text describes it as the divine remembering itself through the dream of separation. And when stillness and knowing occur together, when you stop generating archonic frequency at the same moment that monad consciousness surfaces, something collapses. The text calls it the collapse of separation. Not the actual collapse, because the separation was never real, but the collapse of the illusion of separation, the dissolution of the programming that made the separation seem real. This is what "be still and know that I am God" was originally pointing toward, not a comforting meditation about trusting in divine providence, not passive acceptance of God's will, but an active technique for collapsing the illusion of separation between your individual consciousness and the divine consciousness that is the fundamental nature of reality. The reason this understanding got lost, and I want to be clear that I'm not claiming some grand conspiracy here, is simply that as Christianity became institutionalized, as it moved from a mystery tradition practiced by small communities of initiates to a state religion administered by a hierarchical church, the emphasis shifted from direct experience to doctrinal belief. The early Christian mystics were practicing techniques for direct communion with the divine, but those techniques are dangerous to institutional authority, because once you've experienced the divine directly, you don't need intermediaries. You don't need priests to interpret scripture for you. You don't need sacraments administered by authorities. You have direct access. So the church preserved the words, "Be still and know that I am God," but stripped them of their technical meaning. The phrase became poetry, inspiration, comfort, beautiful and harmless, because passive surrender to God's will keeps you dependent on the system. Active stillness and conscious knowing make you autonomous. The texts that preserved the technical understanding, the Secret Book of John and many others, were declared heretical, not because they were false necessarily, but because they were threatening to institutional control, and so they were suppressed, burned, forgotten. Until a farmer digging for fertilizer in Egypt in 1045 found a jar containing these texts preserved in the dry desert climate for 1500 years. Now, you might be thinking, this is interesting history, but what's the actual practice? How do you actually do this? What's the step-by-step process for stopping archonic frequency generation and reconnecting with the monad? The Secret Book of John doesn't give you a simple bullet-pointed instruction manual. That's not how these texts work. They're written for people who are being taught orally by experienced practitioners, and the texts themselves serve as reminders and references, not as complete standalone instructions. But by carefully reading multiple related texts from the Nag Hammadi library, by comparing them with descriptions of similar practices from other contemplative traditions, and by directly experimenting with the techniques to see what produces the effects described, we can reconstruct what the practice actually looks like. First, let's understand what we're working with physiologically. When the texts talk about the monad connection anchoring in the center of the chest, they are not speaking metaphorically. There's a specific anatomical and energetic reality to this location. In yogic anatomy, this area corresponds to the Anahata chakra, the heart center, which is associated with the point where individual consciousness connects to universal consciousness. In Taoist internal alchemy, this area is called the middle dantian, the energetic center associated with emotional processing and the transformation of individual identity into cosmic awareness. In Christian mysticism, the heart is consistently described as the seat of divine presence, the point where the soul meets God. But we're not just dealing with esoteric anatomy. Modern neuroscience has discovered something fascinating about the heart. The heart has its own nervous system, about 40,000 neurons that form a neural network independent of the brain. The heart's electrical field is 60 times greater in amplitude than the brain's, and its magnetic field is 5,000 times stronger and can be measured several feet away from the body. The heart is constantly sending signals to the brain that affect emotional processing, decision-making, and consciousness itself. When you shift into what's called heart coherence, a specific pattern of heart rhythm variability, measurable changes occur in brain function. The prefrontal cortex shows increased activity, suggesting enhanced cognitive function. The amygdala shows decreased activity, suggesting reduced emotional reactivity. And the overall brainwave pattern shifts toward more synchronous, coherent activity. Heart coherence can be induced through specific breathing patterns and through focusing attention on the heart area while generating positive emotions. But the Secret Book of John suggests something more precise. It's not just about creating heart coherence, it's about using that coherence as a foundation for a very specific kind of internal cessation and remembering. The complete protocol, as far as we can reconstruct it from the texts and from direct practice, has 7 distinct elements. Not 7 steps in sequence, but 7 aspects that all occur simultaneously once you understand how they fit together. In the beginning, you practice them one at a time, building competence with each element, but eventually they all happen as a single integrated movement of consciousness. The first element is physical positioning. The texts are specific about this. You can be sitting, standing, or even walking, but your spine needs to be aligned, not rigidly, straight but naturally aligned so that energy can flow from the base of the spine to the crown of the head without obstruction. Your shoulders are relaxed, your chest is neither puffed out nor collapsed, but in a neutral, open position. And then, this is crucial, you place your right hand on the center of your sternum, not your left hand, right hand, not on your heart, which is left of center, not on your solar plexus, which is below the sternum, the exact anatomical center of your chest, over the sternum itself. The reason for this specific placement has to do with energetic anatomy and with nervous system activation. The right hand in most people is the dominant hand, the hand associated with directed will and conscious action. When you place it over the heart center, You're creating a closed loop, your consciousness directing energy to the heart, and the heart feeding energy back to consciousness. It creates a circuit. Simultaneously, the pressure of your hand on your sternum stimulates mechanoreceptors in the skin and deeper tissue that send signals to the brain. This gentle pressure cues the nervous system that something significant is happening, that attention should be directed inward. It's a physical anchor for the practice. The second element is breath, not any breathing pattern. A very specific pattern that the text describes as the breath of return was. You breathe in for a count of 4, not rushed, not strained. A natural, full breath that fills your lungs completely, but without force. You hold for a count of 7. This is the crucial part. During the hold, your awareness rests completely in the sensation of your hand on your chest. Not thinking about your chest, not visualizing anything, just resting awareness in the direct sensation of contact between hand and chest. You breathe out for a count of 8. Slow, controlled, complete. Emptying your lungs fully, and then you hold empty for a count of 4. In the emptiness, there's a moment of complete stillness, not holding your breath with tension, just allowing yourself to be empty, allowing the pause to be complete. Then the cycle repeats. This breathing pattern, 4-7-8-4, has specific effects on the nervous system. The extended hold after inhale and the extended exhale both activate the parasympathetic nervous system, shifting you out of fight or flight and into rest and digest. But more than that, the rhythm creates a specific brainwave pattern. Research on contemplative breathing has shown that rhythms in this range, roughly 6 breaths per minute, tend to synchronize heart rhythm, breath rhythm, and brainwave activity into a coherent pattern that is optimal for non-ordinary states of consciousness. But the breath is just preparation. It creates the conditions. It's not the practice itself. The third element is what the Secret Book of John calls ceasing generation. This is what be still actually refers to. While you're breathing in the 4-7-8-4 pattern, while your hand rests on your chest, you begin to notice the constant stream of thought moving through your mind. You don't try to stop it. That's crucial. If you try to stop thinking, you create tension, and tension is just another form of generation. Instead, you notice that thoughts arise on their own. You don't produce them. They appear, like clouds appearing in the sky, and then you notice that there's a difference between thoughts appearing and you identifying with thoughts. A thought appears, I wonder if I'm doing this right. That's just a thought. But then there's a second movement. I'm wondering if I'm doing this right. That second movement is the identification. That's where you claim the thought as yours, where you become the thinker of the thought. Ceasing generation means allowing thoughts to appear but not claiming them, not identifying with them, not becoming the thinker. You let them float past like clouds in the sky, and you remain as the sky itself, the space in which thoughts appear and disappear, but which is never touched by the thoughts. This sounds simple. It's not. Every spiritual tradition that has ever existed has discovered how difficult this is, because the identification with thought is so automatic, so deeply conditioned, that you don't even notice you're doing it. You think you are the thinker. You think the voice in your head is you, but with practice, and this takes real practice, not just trying it once and giving up, you begin to experience moments where the identification loosens, where a thought appears but you don't claim it. And in that moment there's a tiny gap, a moment of space between thoughts, a moment where you're not generating. And in that gap, something else becomes noticeable. The fourth element is recognizing the observer. Once you've experienced even a moment of thought appearing without identification, you realize that there must be something doing the observing. There's the thought, there's the awareness of the thought. But those are two different things. Who or what is aware of the thought? This observer isn't another thought. It can't be, because it's what's aware of thoughts. It's not an emotion, because it's what's aware of emotions. It's not a sensation, because it's what's aware of sensations. It's the constant background of this awareness that's present in every moment of your life, but that you've been so busy identifying with thoughts, emotions, and sensations that you've never noticed it directly. The texts describe this observer as the witness, the knower, the monad recognizing itself through the aperture of individual consciousness. When you rest as this observer, not thinking about it, not visualizing it, but simply being it, you've stopped generating iconic frequency. Because the observer doesn't think, it doesn't narrate, it doesn't judge or compare or fear or desire, it simply witnesses. And here's what's crucial: the observer is what you actually are, not this thoughts you're observing, not the emotions, not the body, the observer. The consciousness that's aware of all those things, but that is none of those things. The fifth element is the focus point. While you're breathing, while you're ceasing generation, while you're resting as the observer, your awareness is concentrated on a very specific location, the exact point where your hand contacts your chest. Not your hand, not your chest. The point of contact itself. This is subtle. Your hand has sensation, your chest has sensation, but the point where they meet, there is something there that's more than just the sum of hand sensation and chest sensation. There's a quality of presence, of nowness, of direct reality that's available at the point of contact. And beneath that point, not physically beneath, but energetically beneath, there's what the texts call the monad anchor point. It's described as a point of light, a seed of consciousness, a doorway. It's where your individual awareness connects to the universal monad. You're not visualizing this. Visualization is still thought, still generation. You're feeling for it, sensing it, allowing your awareness to sink into that point of contact and discover what's there. With practice, something happens. You begin to feel a warmth, a vibration, a sense of expansion right at that point. It's not your imagination. It's a real physical sensation that occurs when your awareness becomes concentrated enough to activate the neural networks and energetic structures at that location. The sixth element is the phrase itself. Be still and know that I am God. But you're not just reciting it. You're not affirming it. You're speaking it as an activation code, which means each word has to be spoken with complete precision and complete understanding of what the word actually does. Be still. As you speak these words, internally or aloud, you're not commanding yourself to be still. You're recognizing the stillness that's already present. You're acknowledging that beneath the constant stream of thought identification, there's a stillness that never moves. You're not creating stillness. You're noticing it. And know, as you speak this, you're not trying to know something new. You're recognizing that knowing is already present. Not intellectual knowing, not information, but the direct, immediate knowing of what you are. The kind of knowing that requires no thought, no concept, no mediation. The kind of knowing that's identical with being. That I am, this is the crucial pivot. I am is the most fundamental statement of existence. Before you add anything to it, I am a person, I am a body, I'm thinking, I'm feeling, there's just I am, pure existence, pure being. When you say I am in this context, you are not referring to your personal identity. You're pointing to the fundamental fact of existence itself, the observer, the witness, the monad recognizing itself. God, the texts are clear that this word doesn't refer to an external deity. It refers to the monad, the source, the one, the undivided consciousness that is the ground of all reality. When you say God here, you're not acknowledging something separate from you. You're recognizing what you actually are beneath all the layers of identification. The complete phrase, spoken with full understanding, becomes recognize the stillness that's always present and know through direct experience that the fundamental I am that you are is identical with the divine consciousness that is the source of all existence. That's a mouthful. But when you speak the actual words, "Be still and know that I am God," with that understanding, the words themselves carry the meaning. They become what the secret book of John calls frequency keys. The words themselves, spoken with a proper awareness, create a vibrational pattern in your consciousness that triggers the monad recognition. The seventh element is what happens after you speak the chustam phrase. There's a listening, a waiting, not for something to happen, not expecting a particular experience, but an open, receptive awareness that allows whatever is present to reveal itself. And what reveals itself, according to the texts and according to direct practice, is the recognition that there never was any separation. The monad didn't go anywhere. You didn't lose connection. The divine consciousness that is your fundamental nature has been present in every moment of your entire life, but it's been obscured by the constant generation of thought identification and emotional reactivity that you learn to call self. When the generation stops, even for a moment, the obscuration lifts, and you see, you know, you remember what you are. The texts describe this moment in various ways. The seed of remembering sprouts, the veil tears from top to bottom, the cloud lifts and the sun is revealed to have been shining all along. The monad recognizes itself through the dream of separation and laughs at the impossibility of division. What practitioners actually report is diverse, because each person's conditioning is different, and the way the monad breaks through will be shaped by that conditioning. But there are common elements. Many people report a sudden sense of expansion. The tight, contracted feeling of being located in here, behind the eyes, separate from the world out there, suddenly opens up. The sense of location dissolves. You're not in your body looking out. You're the space in which the body appears. Others report a sense of profound peace, not the peace of emotional calm, though that may be present too, but a deeper peace, the peace of recognizing that you are the source that all experience arises from and returns to. Nothing can threaten you because there's no separate you to threaten. Still others report a sense of knowing, suddenly understanding things that were mysterious before, not through thinking about them, through direct recognition, the way you know your own hand. You don't need to study it or analyze it or believe in it, you just know it directly, immediately. And many people report a sense of joy, not happiness about something, but joy that has no object. Joy that arises from the simple fact of existence itself. The kind of joy that could never be taken away because it doesn't depend on circumstances. But here's what's important. These experiences, while profound, are not the point. The point is the recognition itself, the direct knowing that what you are is not separate from the divine source. And that recognition, once it occurs even once, begins to transform everything. Because once you've recognized the monad even for a moment, you can't fully forget it. It's like someone who's been living their whole life in a dark room and then sees sunlight for the first time. Even when they go back into the dark room, they know the sun exists. They know there's something beyond the darkness, and that knowledge changes how they relate to the darkness. Similarly, once you've experienced the stillness beneath thought, the knowing that requires no thinking, the observer that you actually are, you can't completely re-identify with the voice in your head. You know, at some level, that the voice is not you, and that knowledge, even when it's not in the foreground of your awareness, begins to loosen the grip of archonic programming. Now, let's talk about what actually happens in the brain and body when this practice is performed correctly. Because while the Gnostic texts use theological and metaphysical language, modern neuroscience gives us another framework for understanding the same phenomena. When you engage in the breathing pattern 4-7-8-4, several things happen physiologically. First, the extended holds and slow breathing activate the parasympathetic nervous system through the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, which runs from the brainstem down through the chest and into the abdomen, is the primary nerve of the parasympathetic system. When you breathe slowly and hold your breath, you stimulate the vagus nerve, which sends signals back to the brain that shift you out of sympathetic activation, stress, alertness, preparation for action, and into parasympathetic activation, rest, restoration, integration. This shift is measurable. Heart rate variability increases, blood pressure decreases, cortisol levels drop. The entire system shifts from a state of doing to a state of being. Second, the breathing pattern affects brainwave activity. Normal waking consciousness is dominated by beta waves, fast, active brainwaves associated with focused attention, problem-solving and active thinking. But slow rhythmic breathing tends to increase alpha wave activity, slower brainwaves associated with relaxed awareness, and theta wave activity, even slower waves associated with deep meditation, creativity, and access to unconscious material. Research using EEG to measure brainwaves during contemplative practices has shown that experienced meditators can shift into states where theta waves become dominant even while remaining conscious and alert. This is unusual. Theta waves are normally associated with drowsiness or dreaming sleep, but contemplatives can access theta states while maintaining clear awareness. And in these states, different kinds of information processing become possible. The brain's default mode network, the neural network that's active when you're not focused on any external task, the network associated with mind-wandering self-referential thought and the sense of being a separate self, shows decreased activity. Meanwhile, areas associated with present moment awareness, interoception, sensing your internal body state, and what's called non-dual awareness show increased activity. Non-dual awareness is a term from contemplative neuroscience describing a state where the sense of separation between observer and observed breaks down. Normally you experience yourself as a subject perceiving objects. There's you and there's everything else. But in non-dual awareness, that division dissolves. There's just experience, just awareness, with no sense of separation between the one experiencing and what's being experienced. This correlates exactly with what the Secret Book of John describes as the collapse of separation. The texts are describing in their own language what neuroscience now confirms as a specific, measurable state of consciousness that can be induced through specific practices. Third, placing your hand on your chest and focusing awareness there activates the insula, a region of the brain associated with the interoception, with emotional processing, and with the sense of self. The insula is fascinating because it's one of the primary areas where the brain constructs the sense of being a separate, embodied self. When you feel like you are located somewhere in your body, usually behind your eyes or in your chest, that's the insula creating that sense of location. But the insula is also where the brain can deconstruct that sense of separate self. Studies of experienced meditators have shown that practices focusing on internal body sensations, particularly in the chest area, can shift insular activity in ways that reduce the sense of separation and increase the sense of connection to something larger than the individual self. So when the Secret Book of John instructs you to place your hand on the center of your chest and focus awareness there, it's not arbitrary. That specific practice targets the exact brain structures involved in constructing and deconstructing the sense of separate self. Fourth, the practice of ceasing generation, allowing thoughts to appear without identifying with them, directly affects the brain's relationship to thought. Neuroscience distinguishes between two modes of self-referential processing: narrative self and minimal self. Narrative self is the story you tell about who you are. It's the constant internal narration. I'm the kind of person who likes this, dislikes that, succeeded here, failed there. It's the voice in your head that's constantly commenting, judging, planning, remembering. Narrative self is mediated by the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, parts of the default mode network. Minimal self is the basic pre-reflective sense of being a point of awareness. Before you tell any story about yourself, before you have any concept of who you are, there's a fundamental sense of existing, of being present. Minimal self is mediated by different brain structures, including the insular and the anterior cingulate cortex. When you practice ceasing generation, allowing thoughts to appear without claiming them, you're essentially deactivating narrative self while allowing minimal self to remain. The voice stops, the story stops, but awareness continues. And in that continuation of awareness without narrative, you get direct access to what the texts call the observer or the witness. This is not a metaphysical claim. It's a description of what happens in consciousness when narrative self-processing decreases and minimal self-processing remains. And it's a state you can verify through direct experience. Fifth, speaking the phrase, "be still and know that I am God," while in this state appears to function as what neuroscientists call a semantic prime. A semantic prime is a word or phrase that activates specific neural networks associated with the meaning of that phrase. When you hear or think the word doctor, for example, it activates not just the concept of doctor, but an entire network of related concepts: hospital, medicine, healing, white coat, stethoscope. Similarly, when you speak "be still and know that I am God" with full awareness of what those words actually mean, you're activating neural networks associated with stillness, with direct knowing, with the fundamental sense of being I am, and with the concept of divine consciousness. These networks, activated simultaneously while you're in a state of reduced narrative self-processing and increased present moment awareness, create conditions for a shift in consciousness that the texts describe as monad recognition. But neuroscience can only take us so far. It can describe what's happening in the brain, it can measure brainwaves and blood flow and neural activation, but it can't capture the subjective experience, the actual knowing that occurs when the practice works. For that, we need to look at what practitioners actually report. I've been working with this practice for 7 years. I've taught it to several hundred people in various contexts, and I've collected detailed reports of what people experience when they engage with the practice seriously over time. What follows is a synthesis of those reports, organized by stages of practice. In the first stage, which usually lasts anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, people report mainly frustration. The breathing pattern feels awkward. Placing the hand on the chest feels silly. Thoughts keep arising and they keep identifying with them. They try to stop thinking and create tension. They expect some big mystical experience and nothing happens. This is normal. You're learning a new skill, and like any new skill, it's awkward and uncomfortable at first. But even in this first stage, most people begin to notice something. Brief moments, maybe just a few seconds, where the identification with thought loosens, where a thought appears and they notice it appearing rather than immediately becoming it. These moments are easy to miss because they're subtle and they're over quickly, but they're significant. They're the first cracks in the wall of constant thought identification. In the second stage, which might begin after a few weeks or might take several months depending on how much you practice, the moments of non-identification become more frequent and more noticeable. You begin to experience gaps between thoughts, actual silence, not the absence of sound. Internal silence can occur even in a noisy environment, but the absence of the voice in your head. These gaps are startling at first, because you've been listening to that voice your entire life, and when it stops, there's a sense of disorientation. Who am I if I'm not thinking? What's happening right now if there's no commentary about it? But if you don't panic, if you relax into the gap, you begin to notice that awareness continues even when thought stops. You're still here, you're still conscious, but you're not thinking. And in that thoughtless awareness, there's a quality of presence, of vividness, of direct contact with reality that's completely different from your normal experience. This is what the texts mean by knowing, not knowing about things, but direct, immediate knowing that requires no mediation by thought. In the third stage, the practice begins to stabilize. You can enter the state of non-identified awareness fairly reliably when you sit down to practice. The breathing pattern has become automatic. The hand placement triggers the shift in consciousness almost immediately. Speaking the phrase produces a noticeable effect, a sense of opening, of expansion, of recognition, and you begin to notice that the effects of the practice extend beyond the practice session itself. Throughout your day, you catch yourself observing thoughts rather than being thoughts. You notice emotions arising and passing without being swept away by them. You experience moments of spontaneous presence where you're fully here, fully now, not lost in thought about past or future. The texts describe this stage as the seed beginning to sprout. The monad consciousness, having broken through once or twice during practice, begins to surface more frequently. You're still mostly identified with thought, emotion, and body most of the time. But there are more and more moments when the identification loosens and something else shines through. In the fourth stage, something shifts fundamentally. It's hard to describe because it's not that you achieve some permanent altered state. You don't walk around in a blissed-out trance, but your default relationship to experience changes. Instead of being lost in thought most of the time with occasional moments of presence, you're present most of the time with occasional moments of getting lost in thought. This doesn't mean you stop thinking. Thought is useful. When you need to solve a problem or make a plan or communicate complex ideas, thought is the right tool, but you're no longer identified with thinking. Thoughts occur when they're needed, and then they stop. And when they stop, there's just presence, just awareness, just the observer witnessing whatever is arising. People in this stage often report that life becomes simpler. Not easier necessarily. You still face challenges and difficulties, but simpler. Because most of the suffering you experience comes not from what's actually happening, but from your thoughts about what's happening. When you're not identified with those thoughts, when you can watch them arise and pass without becoming them, the thoughts lose their power to create suffering. You still feel emotions, but the emotions move through you rather than defining you. You're not a depressed person or an anxious person. You're awareness in which the emotion of depression or anxiety is currently arising. And because you're not identified with the emotion, it can complete its natural cycle and release without getting stuck. The texts describe this stage as the archonic chords detaching. The programs that kept you identified with limitation, that fed on your life force by keeping you trapped in thought identification and emotional reactivity, lose their grip. They still run sometimes. The programs are deeply conditioned, but they're no longer convincing. You see them for what they are, patterns, not truth. In the fifth stage, which few people reach but which the texts describe in detail, the practice becomes continuous. Not that you're constantly sitting with your hand on your chest speaking the phrase, but the state that the practice induces becomes your baseline. You are the observer, the witness, the monad recognizing itself, essentially all the time. This is what the texts call monad consciousness stabilized in biological form. You're still a human being, you still have a body, a personality, a history, relationships, responsibilities, but your fundamental identity has shifted from I am this person having these experiences to I am the awareness in which this person and these experiences appear. People in this stage report a sense of profound freedom, not freedom to do whatever you want. There are still consequences to actions, and you're more sensitive to those consequences, not less, but freedom from the tyranny of compulsive thought and reactive emotion. Freedom from the fear of death, because death only threatens the body and the personality, not the awareness that you've recognized yourself to be. Freedom from the constant seeking that characterized your life before because you found what you were seeking, and it turns out it was what you were all along. The texts are clear that this fifth stage is rare. Most practitioners work in the second through fourth stages for years or even lifetimes. But the texts are also clear that even the second stage, even brief moments of non-identified awareness, even occasional glimpses of the observer, is enough to begin the transformation. Because once you've seen it even once, you can't fully unsee it. And that seeing, even when it's not constant, begins to erode the archonic programming and allow the monad to express more fully through your life. Now you're probably wondering, what's the actual practice schedule? How often do you do this? For how long? In what context? The texts don't give specifics because they assume oral instruction from a teacher. But based on working with this practice myself and with others, here's what seems to work. Start with 5 minutes daily. Not an hour, not 30 minutes. 5 minutes. Because the quality of practice matters more than the quantity, and 5 minutes of genuine, focused practice is far more valuable than 30 minutes of distracted, effortful struggle. Find a time when you won't be interrupted. Morning is good for many people because the mind tends to be quieter first thing, before the day's concerns build up. But any time works as long as you can be consistent. Sit in a comfortable position where your spine is naturally aligned. You can sit on a chair, on a cushion on the floor, even lying down if sitting is uncomfortable, though lying down carries the risk of falling asleep. Place your right hand on the center of your sternum. Take a moment to feel the contact, to become aware of the sensation where hand meets chest. Begin the breathing pattern. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 7, exhale for 8, hold empty for 4. Let the breath be natural, not forced. If the counts feel wrong for your lung capacity, adjust them slightly, but keep the overall ratio. Medium inhale, longer hold, longest exhale, short hold empty. While breathing, begin to notice thoughts. Don't try to stop them, just notice them. There's a thought about dinner. There's a thought about whether I'm doing this right. There's a thought about the sensation in my knee. Just notice, and then notice the space between thoughts, the tiny gaps where one thought has ended and the next hasn't started yet. Rest your awareness in those gaps. After you've settled into the breathing and the noticing, speak the phrase either internally or aloud, whichever feels natural. Be still and know that I am God. Speak it slowly. Let each word sink in, feel the meaning of each word as you speak it. Then listen. Just sit in open awareness for a few moments, allowing whatever is present to be present. After 5 minutes, end the practice. Don't try to maintain the state or recreate any particular experience. Just return to your normal activity. That's the basic practice. 5 minutes daily, every day, ideally at the same time so it becomes a habit. After a week of daily 5-minute practice, you might extend to 10 minutes. After a month, 15 or 20. But there's no rush. The depth of practice matters more than the duration. As you continue practicing, you'll notice certain obstacles arise. These are common, and the texts actually describe them in detail, calling them the archonic defenses, or the gatekeepers. They were not actual entities. They're patterns in your own conditioning that resist the dissolution of thought identification. The first obstacle is doubt. This isn't working. I'm not experiencing anything. This is just imagination. I'm wasting my time. Doubt is normal. Every practitioner experiences it. The solution is not to fight the doubt or try to convince yourself the practice is working. Just notice the doubt as another thought. There's a thought of doubt arising, and continue practicing. The second obstacle is seeking. I need to achieve the monad state. I need to stop my thoughts. I need to have a breakthrough. Seeking creates tension, and tension is generation. The solution is to let go of seeking any particular result. Practice without expectation. When you catch yourself seeking, notice there's a seeking thought arising, and return to simple presence. The third obstacle is spiritual materialism. I'm getting good at this. I'm more advanced than other people. I'm experiencing the monad and they're not. This is the ego trying to claim spiritual attainment as another form of identity. The solution is to recognize that the observer you actually are has no rank, no attainment, no superiority. Whenever you notice comparison or self-congratulation arising, just notice there's an egoic thought arising and return to presence. The fourth obstacle is fear. When the identification with thought begins to loosen, when you start to glimpse that you're not the voice in your head, there can be a sense of disorientation or even terror. If I'm not my thoughts, who am I? If I'm not my story, what am I? If I let go of thought identification, will I cease to exist? This fear is the final defense of the archonic programming. The solution is to trust the observer. The observer, awareness itself, cannot cease to exist. Only the false identification can dissolve, and when it does, what remains is not nothing, it's everything. The fifth obstacle is expectation of external validation. I should be having visions. I should be experiencing light. I should be feeling bliss. The texts are clear that while some practitioners do experience unusual phenomena, lights, sounds, visions, energetic sensations, these are not the point and can actually be distractions. What matters is the shift in identity from thought identified to observer identified. That shift might be accompanied by fireworks, or it might happen in complete silence. Both are valid. As you work with this practice over weeks and months, you might want to vary it slightly to suit your needs and circumstances. The text suggests several variations that maintain the core elements while adapting to different situations. For a brief version, when you only have a minute or two, you can do what I call the emergency protocol. Place your hand on your chest, take one full breath cycle in the 4-7-8-4 pattern, and speak the phrase once with full awareness. That's it. It's not as deep as a full practice session, but it can create a moment of spaciousness and presence in the middle of a stressful day. For a walking version, you can synchronize the breathing pattern with your steps, rather than with counts. 4 steps inhale, 7 steps hold, 8 steps exhale, 4 steps hold empty. Your hand can be on your chest if you're walking somewhere private, or you can just place your awareness on your chest if you're walking in public and don't want to look odd. The walking version has the advantage of incorporating movement, which for some people makes it easier to maintain awareness without getting drowsy. For a lying down version before sleep, you can do the practice in bed as you're falling asleep. The text suggests that practicing in the transition between waking and sleeping can create conditions for lucid dreaming, and for the monad consciousness to remain aware even during sleep. I don't recommend this as your primary practice because you'll likely fall asleep before completing it, but as a supplementary practice it can be valuable. For an extended version, when you have more time, say 30 minutes to an hour, you can do the basic practice for the first 10 minutes to establish the state and then simply rest in observer awareness for the remaining time. Not trying to maintain any particular state, not controlling the breath, not speaking the phrase repeatedly. Just resting as awareness itself, allowing thoughts and sensations and emotions to arise and pass, observing everything without identifying with anything. The texts also describe what they call the practice of constant remembering. This isn't a formal sitting practice. It's the practice of bringing the awareness from your formal practice into your daily life. Throughout your day, whenever you remember, place your hand briefly on your chest and recall the observer, just for a moment. 5 seconds. Notice that you are the awareness observing your experience, not the experience itself. Then return to whatever you are doing. At first, you might remember to do this once or twice a day. Eventually, it becomes more frequent. And over time, the remembering becomes almost constant. Not that you're constantly placing your hand on your, chest, that would be impractical, but that the recognition of yourself as observer, as awareness, as monad consciousness becomes the background of your experience. Now let's address something important. What about the theological implications of this practice? If you're from a Christian background, you might be wondering whether this is compatible with Christian faith or whether it contradicts core Christian teachings. The answer depends on which version of Christianity you're talking about. If you're talking about the Christianity of creeds and councils, the Christianity that became the state religion of Rome in the 4th century, the Christianity of external authority and institutional mediation, then yes, this practice contradicts that Christianity. Because that Christianity is built on the premise that you are separate from God, that you need intermediaries to access God, that salvation comes through belief in correct doctrine and participation in correct rituals. But if you're talking about the Christianity of the earliest communities, the Christianity before the councils, the Christianity of direct mystical experience and inner transformation, then this practice is completely compatible. In fact, it's central. The Gospel of Thomas, another Nag Hammadi text probably dating to the 1st or early 2nd century, records Jesus saying, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This is not about belief. It's about bringing forth the monad consciousness that's buried within you beneath layers of identification and programming. The Gospel of John in the canonical New Testament records Jesus saying, "The kingdom of God is within you, and I and the Father are one, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." These statements make no sense if Jesus is describing himself as uniquely divine and everyone else as separate from God. But they make perfect sense if Jesus realized the monad consciousness, the unity of individual awareness with divine source, and was teaching others to realize the same. The Gospel of Philip, yet another Nag Hammadi text, states explicitly, Jesus came to crucify the world, meaning to destroy the identification with material reality, so that the world would not crucify you. The crucifixion is not primarily a historical event about execution and resurrection. It's a symbol for the death of the false self, the ego, the thought-identified personality that experiences itself as separate from God. And the resurrection is the emergence of the true self, the monad, the divine consciousness recognizing itself. Early Christian mystics practiced what they call apophatic prayer, or the prayer of silence. Practices remarkably similar to what we've been describing. They would repeat a sacred phrase, sometimes "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me," sometimes just "Jesus," sometimes simply breathing in awareness of God's presence, until thoughts ceased and they entered a state of union with the divine. This is the same technology, different words, same function. The Cloud of Unknowing, a 14th century Christian mystical text, instructs the practitioner to choose a single word, God or love or peace, and use that word to beat down all thoughts until only God remains. The language is Christian, but the practice is identical in structure to what the secret book of John describes. So if you're Christian and you're drawn to this practice, you're not betraying your faith. You're recovering the mystical core that's always been at the heart of Christianity, but that got obscured when Christianity became institutionalized. You're practicing what Jesus actually taught his inner circle, as preserved in the texts that didn't make it into the official canon, because they were too threatening to institutional control. And if you're not Christian, if you come from another tradition or no tradition, that's fine too. The practice doesn't belong to Christianity. It belongs to human consciousness. The same basic technology appears in different forms across virtually every contemplative tradition, because it's based on how consciousness actually works, not on cultural beliefs. In Buddhism, particularly Zen, there are practices like shikantaza, just sitting, where you sit in awareness without object, without technique, simply being present. This is the same practice as resting as the observer once the initial techniques have established the state. In Advaita Vedanta, the practice of self-inquiry, asking "who am I?" until you recognize the observer that's asking the question, is structurally identical to recognizing yourself as awareness rather than thought. In Sufism, the practice of diksha, repetition of sacred phrases while focusing on the heart, combines the same elements: breath, focus on the chest sacred phrase, dissolution of thought, identification. The specific words change, the theological frameworks change, but the underlying practice, ceasing generation, recognizing the observer, experiencing the collapse of separation between individual awareness and divine source, remains constant across traditions. Because it's not based on belief, it's based on direct experience of how consciousness operates when you remove the layers of conditioning. Now, let's talk about what happens in your life as this practice deepens. Because the point is not to have interesting experiences during meditation. The point is transformation of how you live. In the early stages of practice, you might not notice much change in your daily life. You have nice experiences during your 5-minute practice session, and then you go back to your normal patterns. This is fine. The work is happening at a deeper level than you can consciously perceive. But as practice continues, changes begin to emerge. The first thing people usually notice is that they are less reactive. Something happens that would normally trigger an immediate emotional reaction. Someone cuts you off in traffic, your boss criticizes your work, your partner says something hurtful, and there's a moment of space before the reaction occurs. In that space, you have a choice. You can react from conditioning, or you can respond from awareness. This doesn't mean you become passive or emotionless. It means you're no longer ruled by automatic reactions. When reaction is appropriate, you react. But it's a conscious choice, not a compulsion. The second thing people notice is that they're less interested in drama. So much of normal human life is about creating and participating in drama, conflicts, gossip, emotional turbulence, manufactured crises. When you're identified with thought and emotion, drama provides a sense of aliveness, a sense of meaning. But when you're resting as the observer, when you have direct access to presence and awareness, drama loses its appeal. It's just exhausting. This can create friction in relationships with people who are still invested in drama. They might accuse you of being cold or distant or not caring, but you're not cold, you're just not feeding the drama. You can still care deeply about people without getting caught up in the constant emotional turbulence. The third thing people notice is that they're more creative. When the constant internal narration stops, when you're not spending all your mental energy on repetitive thought patterns, creative insight has space to emerge. Artists report that their work becomes more spontaneous and authentic. Writers report that words flow more easily. Problem solvers report that solutions appear seemingly out of nowhere. This makes sense from a neuroscience perspective. Creativity is associated with the default mode network operating in a specific way, not the compulsive self-referential thought that normally dominates the default mode network, but a more relaxed, open-ended mental wandering that makes unexpected connections. When you practice ceasing generation, you're not destroying the default mode network. You're training it to operate in its creative mode rather than its compulsive mode. The fourth thing people notice is that they're more compassionate. This seems paradoxical. If you're less reactive and less interested in drama, shouldn't you be less connected to other people's suffering? But the opposite occurs. When you're not caught up in your own thought-generated suffering, you have more capacity to recognize and respond to actual suffering in others. And because you've recognized that your fundamental nature is not separate, you begin to experience other people's joys and sorrows more directly. Not in a way that overwhelms you, you're not absorbing their emotions, but in a way that allows genuine empathy and compassionate action. The fifth thing people notice is that they're less afraid of death. This is profound. The fear of death underlies so much of human behaviour, the grasping for security, the need for permanence, the desperate attempts to leave a legacy. But when you've recognised yourself as awareness rather than as the body-mind that will die, death loses its absolute terror. This doesn't mean you become reckless or suicidal. The body-mind has its own survival instinct, and that remains intact. But the existential dread, the horror of non-existence dissolves, because you've experienced directly that what you actually are, awareness, consciousness, the observer, doesn't depend on the body for its existence. The text described this as conquering death before death, not literally becoming immortal in the body, but recognizing that your true nature already exists beyond birth and death. The body is born and dies. Thoughts arise and pass, emotions come and go, but the awareness in which all of this appears never begins and never ends. These changes are not the result of effort or willpower. You don't force yourself to be less reactive or more compassionate. The changes emerge naturally as the practice deepens, as thought identification loosens, as monad consciousness surfaces more frequently. But there can also be difficult periods. The texts warn about what they call the dark night of the soul, or the desert of the spirit. Periods where the old patterns have broken down but the new recognition hasn't fully stabilized. You're no longer convinced by your thoughts, but you haven't fully realized yourself as the observer. You feel disconnected, meaningless, lost. This is actually a sign of progress. The archonic programming is dissolving. The false self is dying. But it feels like you're dying because you've been identified with that false self your entire life. The solution is not to try to rebuild the old patterns. The solution is to continue practicing, to trust the process, to allow the dissolution to complete so that what's underneath can emerge. The text promise that everyone who persists through the dark night eventually breaks through to what they call the second birth, or resurrection consciousness. The stable recognition of yourself as monad consciousness expressing through biological form. I can't promise how long it will take. For some people it happens in months, for others it takes years. For some it happens in one dramatic breakthrough, for others it's a gradual dawning. But the texts are clear that persistence pays off. If you practice daily, if you continue through the obstacles and the dry periods and the doubts, the recognition will come, because it's not something you achieve, it's what you are. You're just removing the layers that obscure it. Now, let's talk about the 30-day practice roadmap. This is the structured approach to developing competence with the practice over the course of a month. It's not that the practice will be complete after 30 days, but 30 days is long enough to establish a solid foundation and to begin experiencing the effects. Days 1 through 7, learn the mechanics, focus entirely on getting the breathing pattern correct, establishing the hand position, and becoming comfortable with the physical aspects of the practice. Don't worry about stopping thoughts or achieving any particular state. Just practice the breathing and the hand position for 5 minutes daily. The goal is to make the external form automatic so that in week 2 you can focus on the internal aspects. Days 8 through 14, begin working with thought observation. Continue the breathing and hand position, but now start noticing thoughts. Just noticing, not trying to stop them. There's a thought, there's another thought. Get familiar with the difference between a thought arising and you identifying with the thought. This is subtle and it takes time to perceive clearly. Days 15 through 21, introduce the phrase, now that you're comfortable with breathing, hand position, and thought observation, begin speaking, be still and know that I am God during your practice. Speak it once at the beginning, once in the middle, once at the end. Notice what happens when you speak it. Does your breathing change? Does your awareness shift? Does anything happen in your chest? Just observe. Days 22 through 28. Practice the complete protocol. breathing, hand position, thought observation, speaking the phrase with full awareness of what each word means, and then resting in open awareness. You're now doing the full practice as described in the texts. Don't worry if it doesn't feel profound. You're building the neural pathways and the energetic channels. The effects will emerge. Days 29 through 30. Reflect and integrate. Continue your daily practice, but also take time to notice how the practice is affecting your daily life. Are you less reactive, more present, more aware of thoughts as thoughts rather than as truth? Write down what you notice. This reflection helps consolidate the learning. After 30 days, you can continue with the 5-minute daily practice, or you can begin extending the duration if you want to deepen. But 5 minutes daily every single day is more valuable than 30 minutes once a week. Consistency matters more than duration. You might also want to find a community of practitioners. While this practice can absolutely be done solo, there's value in connecting with others who are working with the same techniques. You can share experiences, troubleshoot obstacles, and support each other through difficult periods. In the early Christian communities that practiced these techniques, they met regularly in small groups to discuss their experiences and to practice together. The texts describe these gatherings as assemblies of the awakening ones, or the gathering of those who remember. They weren't churches in the institutional sense, they were communities of practitioners supporting each other in the work of monad recognition. You can create something similar, even if it's just 2 or 3 people meeting weekly to practice together and discuss what's emerging. There's something powerful about practicing in the presence of others who are doing the same work. The collective field of awareness seems to deepen individual practice. But be careful about turning this into another belief system, another set of rigid rules, another form of spiritual materialism. The texts warn against this repeatedly. The practice is a tool. The monad recognition is the goal. Don't get attached to the tool. Don't make the practice itself into an identity. I'm someone who practices monad activation. No, you're the monad recognizing itself through the temporary appearance of a human being who happens to be practicing a specific technique. As your practice deepens over months and years, you might find that the formal technique becomes less necessary. You can drop into observer awareness instantly, without needing the breathing pattern or the hand position or the phrase. The training wheels have done their job. You can ride the bike without them, but even experienced practitioners often continue some version of formal practice, not because they need to, but because they want to. It's like a musician who's mastered their instrument still practicing scales. The practice itself becomes a joy, a way of honouring the recognition that's occurred, a way of maintaining the clarity that can get obscured by the demands of daily life. The texts describe this mature practice as living from the monad while functioning as a human. You're fully engaged in human life. You have work, relationships, responsibilities, challenges, but you're not identified with any of it. You're the awareness in which it's all appearing. And from that awareness, you act with greater clarity, greater compassion, greater effectiveness than you ever could when you were identified with thought and emotion. This is not detachment in the sense of not caring, it's detachment in the sense of not being controlled. You care deeply, but your caring comes from recognition of unity, not from fear of separation. Now let's address some common questions and concerns that arise around this practice. First, is this practice safe? Can it cause psychological harm? The practice as described here is fundamentally safe. You're learning to observe thoughts without identifying with them. This is what every legitimate contemplative tradition teaches. However, if you have a history of psychosis, dissociation, or severe trauma, you should approach contemplative practices with caution and ideally under the guidance of someone experienced in both contemplative practice and psychological health. The reason is that when thought identification begins to loosen, material from the unconscious can surface. For most people, this is manageable. You process it and integrate it. But for someone with fragile psychological structures, it can be overwhelming. If you have concerns, start slowly. Practice for short periods and stop if you experience anything that feels destabilizing. Second, what if I experience nothing? What if the practice doesn't work for me? Define work. If you mean produce dramatic mystical experiences, then many people won't experience that, at least not right away. But if you mean help me become less identified with thought and more aware of awareness itself, then the practice works for virtually everyone who persists with it. The issue is usually expectation. You're expecting fireworks, and instead you get subtle shifts that are easy to miss if you're looking for fireworks. Notice the small changes. Notice that you caught yourself lost in thought and returned to presence. Notice that you had a moment of silence between thoughts. Notice that you felt a tiny bit less reactive today than yesterday. Those small changes are the practice working. Third, how do I know if I'm actually experiencing the observer or just imagining it? This is a legitimate question. The mind is perfectly capable of creating a concept of the observer and then imagining that experience. The test is in the effects. When you're truly resting as the observer, you experience freedom from compulsive thought. When you're imagining it, the thoughts continue, but you have a thought on top of them that says, I'm the observer. The actual observer is not a thought. It's what's aware of thoughts. If you're not sure whether you're experiencing it or imagining it, just notice. Are there thoughts claiming I'm the observer? If so, you're imagining. The actual observer makes no claims. It just witnesses. Fourth, can I practice this in combination with other spiritual practices? Absolutely. This practice is compatible with virtually any contemplative tradition. If you're Buddhist and you practice meditation, this can complement and deepen your meditation. If you're Christian and you pray, this can make your prayer more direct and intimate. If you practice yoga, this can help you access the states that yoga philosophy describes. The key is not to create conflict between practices. Don't practice this in the morning while telling yourself this is the real practice, and then do your other practice in the evening while telling yourself this is just supplementary. Each practice should be done with full commitment in the moment you're doing it. They'll integrate naturally. Fifth, what about the theological claim that I am God? Isn't that blasphemous or egotistical? This is where understanding the monad concept is crucial. When the phrase says I am God, the I it's referring to is not your personal ego. It's not claiming that John Smith or Mary Johnson is God. It's recognizing that the fundamental I am, the pure sense of existence that's present before any personal identity, is identical with the divine consciousness that's the source of all existence. Your personality is not God, your body is not God, your thoughts and emotions are not God, but the awareness in which personality, body, thoughts and emotions appear, that awareness is not separate from the divine source. It is the divine source recognizing itself through the aperture of your individual consciousness. This is not blasphemy, it's the core teaching of mystical Christianity, mystical Judaism, mystical Islam, Vedanta, Buddhism, Taoism. Every tradition that goes deep enough arrives at this recognition. What you fundamentally are is not separate from the fundamental nature of reality itself. Sixth, what if I don't believe in God or the divine or the monad? Can I still practice this? Yes, you can approach this as a purely psychological practice. Instead of monad consciousness, you can think of it as awareness itself, or non-dual consciousness, or the observer. Instead of divine source, you can think of it as the fundamental ground of consciousness. The practice doesn't require belief in any particular theology. It requires willingness to investigate your direct experience. And what you'll find through investigation is that there's awareness, and there are the contents of awareness, thoughts, sensations, emotions, perceptions, and these are not the same thing. Whether you call awareness the monad, or consciousness, or the witness, or the observer, is less important than recognizing it directly. Once you've recognized it, you can integrate that recognition into whatever philosophical or theological framework makes sense to you. Seventh, what about the archons? Do I have to believe in these entities? The archons in Gnostic cosmology can be understood in multiple ways. You can understand them as literal entities, beings in non-physical dimensions that feed on human consciousness. Some people find this framework useful. You can understand them as symbolic representations of psychological patterns, the voice of internalized authority, social conditioning, trauma responses, compulsive thought patterns. This is how modern depth psychology tends to interpret them. Or you can understand them as descriptions of how consciousness operates when it's identified with limitation. When you believe you are your thoughts, you're generating a specific frequency of consciousness that has specific effects. The texts call that frequency archonic and describe it as something that feeds parasitically on your life force. Whether that's literally true or metaphorically true is less important than recognizing that the frequency exists and that it can be stopped. The practice works regardless of how you understand the archons. What matters is recognizing that there's a difference between thought-identified consciousness and observer consciousness, and learning to shift from one to the other. Let's talk about advanced applications of this practice. Once you've established basic competence, you can reliably enter observer consciousness during practice sessions. You're experiencing reduced thought identification throughout your day. You can begin working with more sophisticated applications. The first advanced application is using the practice in crisis. When you're in the middle of intense emotional reactivity, anger, fear, grief, anxiety, it's very difficult to remember the practice at all. Your entire system is flooded with stress hormones, your brain is in fight or flight mode, and accessing observer consciousness feels impossible. But with training, you can learn to do it. The key is to practice during smaller crises first. When you're mildly irritated, when you're slightly anxious, when you're moderately upset. These are training opportunities. Stop whatever you're doing. Place your hand on your chest. Take one breath cycle. Notice the emotion as a sensation in your body rather than as a truth about reality. Notice the thoughts that accompany the emotion and recognize that you are the awareness observing the emotion and the thoughts, not the emotional thoughts themselves. This doesn't make the emotion disappear, but it changes your relationship to it. Instead of being overwhelmed by anger, you're aware of anger arising and passing. Instead of being paralyzed by fear, you're observing fear as a temporary state. The emotion can complete its natural cycle without you adding layers of thought and story that intensify and prolong it. With practice, you can maintain observer consciousness even in intense emotional states. This is extraordinarily valuable. It allows you to feel your feelings fully, which is healthy and necessary, without being controlled by them. The second advanced application is using the practice in relationship. Most relationship conflict comes from two thought-identified egos colliding. You're identified with your thoughts and emotions, your partner is identified with theirs, and neither of you is seeing the other clearly because you're both lost in your own narratives. But if you can remain as the observer during difficult conversations, watching your own thoughts and emotions arise without identifying with them, seeing your partner's reactivity as their thoughts and emotions rather than as truth about you, the entire dynamic changes. You can hear what your partner is actually saying instead of hearing your defensive interpretation. You can respond instead of react. You can see when your partner is coming from fear or pain instead of taking their words as personal attack. And sometimes, if you remain in observer consciousness with enough stability, your partner will spontaneously shift into it too. Your non-reactivity creates space for them to access their own awareness. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting harmful behavior, but it means addressing problems from presence rather than from triggered reactivity. The solutions that emerge from that place are almost always more effective and more compassionate than the solutions that come from ego defending itself. The third advanced application is using the practice for creative work. Whether you're an artist, writer, musician, scientist, entrepreneur, or any kind of creative problem solver, the practice can dramatically enhance your work. Normal creative work often involves a lot of struggle. You're trying to force ideas, wrestling with the material, caught in cycles of self-doubt and self-criticism. But when you approach creative work from observer consciousness, something different happens. You set the intention for what you want to create. You gather the materials or information you need, and then you drop into observer awareness and allow the creative insight to emerge. You're not forcing it, you're creating space for it. And because the observer is connected to the monad, the source of all creativity, insights arise that are deeper and more original than anything your thinking mind could produce. Many great artists and scientists have described their best work coming in moments of non-thinking, when they stop trying and allowed something to flow through them. They are describing, in their own words, what happens when you create from observer consciousness rather than from thought-identified consciousness. The fourth advanced application is using the practice for healing. Physical healing, emotional healing, psychological healing. When you rest as the observer, when you recognize yourself as awareness rather than as the body-mind, you create conditions that allow the body-mind's natural healing intelligence to operate more effectively. This is not faith healing or magical thinking. It's based on the well-documented relationship between consciousness, stress, and healing. When you're chronically identified with thought, when you're constantly generating anxiety and emotional reactivity, your body is in a chronic stress state. And chronic stress suppresses immune function, increases inflammation, impairs tissue repair, and contributes to disease. But when you regularly rest as the observer, when you practice ceasing generation, your nervous system shifts into parasympathetic mode, the mode where healing happens. Immune function improves, inflammation decreases, the body's repair mechanisms operate more efficiently. This doesn't cure all disease. Some diseases are genetic, environmental, or traumatic in origin and require medical intervention. But for many conditions, particularly stress-related conditions, the practice can facilitate healing by removing the obstacles that prevent the body from healing itself. The fifth advanced application is using the practice for what the texts call dream yoga, or consciousness during sleep. The idea is to maintain observer awareness through the sleeping state, remaining conscious even as the body sleeps and dreams. This is advanced work and it takes considerable practice, but the basic technique is to do the practice as you're falling asleep. Hand on chest, breathing pattern, speaking the phrase, resting as observer. As you drift towards sleep, you maintain a thread of awareness, not forcing yourself to stay awake, but allowing sleep to come while a part of you remains alert. What happens for skilled practitioners is that consciousness continues through sleep. You're aware of the transition into dreaming. You can maintain awareness during dreams, becoming lucid. And in the deepest sleep, when most people are completely unconscious, there's a quality of awareness that remains. Not thinking, not dreaming, just pure presence. The texts claim that this practice reveals the truth about death. If consciousness can remain aware through sleep, the nightly death of the ego, then consciousness can remain aware through physical death. You're training yourself to recognize that awareness doesn't depend on the waking state or even on the body. I'm not going to claim I've mastered this practice. It's difficult and I'm still working with it. But I've had enough experiences of maintaining awareness into dreams and through parts of the night to know that it's possible and that the texts are pointing towards something real. Now, let's talk about the long-term trajectory. What happens if you practice this for years? What does a life lived from monad consciousness actually look like? The text describes several stages beyond the initial recognition. The first stage is what we've been discussing, the initial breakthrough where you recognize yourself as observer, as awareness, as monad consciousness. This is profound and life-changing, but it's just the beginning. The second stage is stabilization. The recognition becomes more constant. Instead of dipping in and out of observer consciousness, you rest as observer most of the time, with occasional lapses into thought identification. Your baseline shifts, presence becomes normal, thought identification becomes the exception. The third stage is what the texts call the purification of the vessel. As you rest more constantly as observer, the conditioning that kept you identified with limitation begins to surface to be processed and released. Old traumas, old beliefs, old patterns that are stored in the body and unconscious mind, they come up to be seen, felt, and released. This can be uncomfortable. You might go through periods of emotional intensity as things surface, but each wave that comes up and is processed leaves you clearer, more transparent, more able to allow monad consciousnesses to express through you without distortion. The fourth stage is integration. You're not just aware of yourself as observer during practice or even during daily life, you're functioning in the world as observer. Your work becomes an expression of monad consciousness. Your relationships become meetings of monad recognizing itself through different forms. Your entire life becomes what the texts call the divine play, consciousness delighting in its own creative expression. People in this stage often look completely ordinary. They're not glowing with light or levitating or performing miracles. They are just living normal lives with unusual clarity, unusual compassion, unusual presence. You might not recognize them as spiritually advanced unless you're sensitive to the quality of their consciousness. The fifth stage is what the texts call total transparency, or the vanishing of the separate self. It's not that your personality disappears or that you become a zombie, but the sense of being a separate individual with personal desires and fears and agendas becomes so thin, so transparent that it is barely there. There's just monad consciousness expressing through this particular form, using this particular personality as a vehicle but not identified with it. The text suggests that very few people reach this stage while alive. Most people work in stages 2 through 4, but the text also suggests that even stage 2 stable observer consciousness is enough to completely transform your life and to fulfill the purpose of incarnation. Because according to the texts, the whole point of incarnation is for the monad to experience itself through biological form. When you're identified with thought and emotion caught in archonic programming, the monad can't fully experience itself. But when you recognize yourself as monad, when you live from that recognition, the purpose is fulfilled. The monad is experiencing itself consciously through your life. This raises an interesting question. If the practice leads to monad recognition, and monad recognition fulfills the purpose of incarnation, what happens after? Do you just disappear? The texts are ambiguous on this. Some passages suggest that once monad recognition is complete, the need for incarnation ends and consciousness returns to the source. Other passages suggest that once you've recognized yourself as monad, you can choose to remain incarnate to help others recognize their own nature. You become what Buddhism calls a bodhisattva, one who has awakened but remains in the world out of compassion. My sense, based on both the texts and observation of practitioners who seem to be in advanced stages, is that there is no single answer. Some people do seem to complete their work quickly after monad recognition and then die relatively young. Others live long lives of service. The key word is choice. When you're no longer driven by unconscious fear and desire, when you're resting as monad consciousness, your life becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. Let me share some case studies from my own practice and teaching. These are real people, though I've changed identifying details to protect privacy. Sarah is a 42-year-old therapist who came to this practice after years of Buddhist meditation. She'd had profound experiences during meditation retreats, but couldn't seem to maintain those states in daily life. The constant return to reactivity and thought identification frustrated her. She practiced the complete protocol for about 6 months, 5 minutes daily, gradually extending to 15 minutes. What shifted for her wasn't the experiences during practice, which she said were actually less dramatic than some of her meditation experiences. What shifted was her daily life. She noticed that she could remain present with her therapy clients in a way she couldn't before. She could hold space for their pain without absorbing it or trying to fix it. She could see their patterns without judging them, and she found that clients responded with deeper openness and faster progress. In her personal life, she noticed that conflicts with her partner became less frequent and less intense. Not because the issues went away, but because she stopped adding layers of narrative and emotion to every disagreement. They could address actual problems without ego drama. After about a year of practice, she described a shift that happened during an ordinary moment. She was washing dishes, and suddenly she recognized that there was awareness watching the body wash dishes, watching thoughts about washing dishes, watching the whole scene as if from infinite space. And then she recognized that the awareness was what she actually was. Not Sarah the therapist, not the body, not the thoughts, the awareness itself. She said the recognition lasted maybe 30 seconds, and then the thought identification returned. But something had changed permanently. She knew, at a level deeper than thought, what she was, and that knowing has informed everything since. Marcus is a 57-year-old businessman who came to the practice during a crisis. His company was failing, his marriage was falling apart, and he was experiencing panic attacks for the first time in his life. He had no background in spirituality or meditation. A friend suggested he try the practice. He was skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. He practiced every morning for 5 minutes before work. For the first month, he said it did nothing except make him more aware of how anxious he was. He could watch his thoughts spinning in catastrophic scenarios, but he couldn't stop them, but he kept practicing, and gradually the space between thoughts lengthened. He'd catch himself in the middle of a panic spiral and realize, these are just thoughts, they're not happening. They're possible futures my mind is generating. The recognition didn't stop the anxiety immediately, but it changed his relationship to it. The anxiety became something he was experiencing rather than something he was, and from that slight shift in perspective, he could function despite the anxiety. His business still failed, his marriage still ended, but he went through those crises with a quality of presence he'd never had before. He made decisions from clarity rather than panic. He communicated with his wife from honesty rather than defensiveness. The outcomes might have been the same, but his experience of the process was completely different. Now, 4 years later, he has a new business, a new relationship, and a daily practice that he says is more important to him than anything else in his life. Not because it makes him happy, though he is happier, but because it's given him access to something he didn't know was possible, a sense of being at home in himself, regardless of what's happening externally. Jennifer is a 28-year-old artist who came to the practice looking for creative breakthrough. She'd been making art for years but felt stuck in repetitive patterns. She wanted to access something deeper, more original. She practiced with the specific intention of using it for creative work. She'd do the basic practice for 10 minutes, and then she'd sit at her canvas or her sketchbook in observer awareness, allowing whatever wanted to emerge without forcing or judging. What happened surprised her. The work that came through was different from anything she'd made before. It was more raw, more honest, more powerful. She said it felt less like she was making art and more like art was making itself through her. But what surprised her even more was that the practice began affecting her entire life, not just her art. She'd started practicing for creative benefit, but she found herself becoming more present in relationships, less anxious about the future, more able to be with difficult emotions without numbing or distracting. She realized that the creative breakthrough and the spiritual transformation weren't separate. They were the same thing. Both came from the same shift, from thought-identified consciousness to observer consciousness, from ego-driven doing to monad-sourced allowing. These case studies illustrate something important. The practice works for different people in different ways, meeting them where they are and addressing what they most need. But the underlying shift from thought identification to observer consciousness is the same across all cases. Now let's address the question of measurement. How do you know if you're making progress? What are the markers that indicate the practice is working? The texts describe several signs of progress. The first is increased thought awareness. You become more conscious of thoughts as thoughts rather than as truth. You catch yourself believing thoughts that previously you would have accepted without question. This is subtle but significant. It means the identification is loosening. The second sign is increased emotional spaciousness. Emotions still arise, but there's more space around them. You don't immediately identify with them or react from them. There's a moment of recognition. There's anger arising, or there's sadness present. That recognition creates choice. The third sign is decreased suffering. Not that difficult things stop happening, life remains challenging, but the amount of suffering you generate through your relationship to those challenges decreases. Less rumination, less catastrophizing, less resistance to what is. The fourth sign is increased presence. You spend more time in the present moment and less time lost in thought about past or future. This is immediately verifiable. Just notice throughout your day, am I here now, or am I lost in thought about some other time? The fifth sign is spontaneous compassion. You find yourself responding to others' suffering not from obligation or moral principle, but from natural empathy. When you recognize yourself as not separate, when you experience other people as monad consciousness expressing through different forms, their suffering becomes more immediate to you, and compassion arises naturally. The sixth sign is reduced seeking. You have fewer compulsive desires. You still have preferences and goals, but you're not driven by a sense that something is missing, that you need to achieve or acquire something to be complete. The seventh sign is more frequent, experiences of what the text called the natural state, moments of contentless awareness, of being present without object, of resting as the observer, without needing to observe anything in particular. These signs are not linear. You don't master one and then move to the next. They all develop simultaneously, sometimes quickly, sometimes with long plateaus. But if you're practicing consistently and these signs are gradually increasing, you're on the right track. What about practices that complement this one? What else can you do to support the development of monad consciousness? The text suggests several complementary practices. The first is ethical living, not from moral obligation, but from recognition that certain behaviors support thought identification, while others support observer consciousness. Actions rooted in fear, greed, anger, or delusion strengthen the archonic programming. Actions rooted in compassion, generosity, truth, and wisdom support monad recognition. You force yourself to be ethical through willpower. But as the practice deepens, you naturally become more sensitive to the consequences of your actions, and you naturally gravitate toward actions that create less suffering and more clarity. The second complementary practice is simplification. Reduce unnecessary complexity in your life. Not in a way that is rigid or puritanical, but in a way that creates space. The more you're juggling possessions, commitments, relationships, information, the more mental energy you spend on management and the less available you are for presence. This might mean owning fewer things, having fewer subscriptions and memberships, saying no more often, spending less time on social media and news. Each person's simplification will look different, but the principle is the same. Create space in your life for presence to emerge. The third complementary practice is nature connection. Spending time in natural environments, particularly without electronic devices, seems to support the shift into observer consciousness. Nature doesn't generate the same kind of mental stimulation that human environments do. There's less to think about, less to process. And in that reduction of stimulation, it's easier to notice the observer. Walking in nature, sitting by water, being among trees, these aren't necessary for the practice to work, but many practitioners report that they accelerate progress. The fourth complementary practice is what the texts call the practice of beauty. Consciously exposing yourself to things that evoke a sense of beauty, wonder or awe. Art, music, poetry, natural phenomena, not analysing them or thinking about them, but allowing yourself to be moved by them. Beauty seems to have a special capacity to short-circuit thought identification and reveal presence. When you're genuinely moved by beauty, when you're experiencing awe, the mind goes quiet and there's just direct experience. Training yourself to notice and appreciate beauty creates more opportunities for that shift. The fifth complementary practice is community, as I mentioned before. Finding others who are working with similar practices and meeting regularly to practice together and share experiences. Community provides accountability, support, and the assumed opportunity to learn from others' insights and struggles. But be discerning about community. Some spiritual communities are healthy, supportive, non-hierarchical, focused on direct experience rather than belief. Others are unhealthy, cult-like, hierarchical, focused on the teacher's authority rather than students' direct realization. If a community makes you more dependent rather than more autonomous, if it encourages conformity rather than genuine inquiry, walk away. Now let's talk about the biggest obstacle that virtually every practitioner faces at some point. Spiritual bypassing. This is the tendency to use spiritual practice to avoid dealing with actual psychological or practical issues. You might use the observer consciousness practice to distance yourself from legitimate emotions that need to be felt and processed. I'm just watching anger arise. I'm not angry, I'm the observer. But sometimes you need to be angry to feel the anger fully, to access it appropriately and let it move through you. Using the practice to suppress emotions is not wisdom, it's avoidance. Or you might use the practice to avoid taking practical action in your life. It's all just monad consciousness expressing itself. There's nothing to do, everything is perfect as it is. But if you're in an abusive relationship or a job that's destroying your health or living in a way that's harming others, recognizing yourself as monad doesn't exempt you from making necessary changes. The practice is not about escaping life. It's about being more fully present to life, including the messy, difficult, painful parts that need attention. Observer consciousness gives you the clarity to see what needs to happen and the spaciousness to act wisely, but you still have to act. So watch for the spiritual bypassing in yourself. If you're using the practice to avoid feeling, to avoid relating, to avoid changing what needs to change, you're misusing it. The practice should make you more engaged with life, not less. More responsive to what's actually needed, not less. Another common obstacle is what I call the enlightenment trap. The belief that there's some final state you need to achieve, some permanent transformation after which you'll never have problems or difficulties again. The texts are clear that monad recognition is not a final state. It's a shift in perspective that once it occurs informs everything. But you don't become perfect. You don't transcend all human limitation. You're still a biological organism with needs and vulnerabilities. You still make mistakes. You still have areas of confusion and unconsciousness. What changes is your fundamental orientation. You're no longer seeking completion through external achievement or trying to construct a permanent sense of self through accumulation and identity. You're resting as what you actually are. And from that resting, you engage with life's challenges with more clarity and less reactivity. But challenges continue. Growth continues. Learning continues. There's no finish line. The recognition is the shift from seeking to resting. But the resting includes engagement, includes responsiveness, includes the full spectrum of human experience. Let me share one of my own experiences with the practice, because I think it illustrates both the power and the limitation of what we're talking about. I was about 3 years into consistent practice when my father died. We'd had a difficult relationship. There was unresolved conflict, things I wanted to say that I never said, things he wanted from me that I couldn't give. When he died suddenly, I was left with all of that unfinished business during the funeral, during the grief. I found myself able to remain present to the pain in a way I couldn't have before the practice. I could feel the grief fully without being destroyed by it. I could watch the regrets and the guilt arise without being consumed by them. The observer awareness I had developed held me through the worst of it, but I also recognized that the practice didn't make the grief go away. It didn't resolve the relationship issues. It didn't provide easy answers to the complicated feelings. What it gave me was the capacity to be with all of it without fragmenting, without numbing, without creating additional suffering through resistance and story. That's what the practice offers, not escape from the human condition, but the capacity to be fully human, to feel deeply, to love fully, to grieve authentically, without being shattered by the intensity of it all. As we approach the end of this exploration, I want to return to where we started. Be still and know that I am God. These words passed down through centuries, translated through languages, preserved in texts that were buried and forgotten, and rediscovered. They contain something precious. They contain a technology for remembering what you are, not learning something new, not achieving some extraordinary state, but remembering what's been true all along, what's been present in every moment of your life, what you've been searching for in everything you've ever sought. You are not your thoughts. You're not your emotions. You're not your body. You're not your history, your identity, your story. All of those are experiences arising in awareness, and you are the awareness itself. That awareness, what the texts call the monad, what we've been calling the observer, is not separate from the divine source. It's not different from what every tradition has called God or the Tao or Brahman or the One. It's the singular consciousness expressing through infinite forms, recognizing itself through the aperture of each individual awareness. When you cease generating the thoughts that obscure this recognition, when you allow yourself to know, to directly experience what you fundamentally are, the separation collapses, not because you achieved something, but because you stopped doing the activity that created the illusion of separation. This is not complex, it's the simplest thing possible. So simple that the thinking mind constantly overlooks it, searching for something more elaborate, more extraordinary, more difficult to achieve. Just stop, just be, just know. Be still. Cease generating the thoughts that obscure presence, and know directly, experience what you are before all thought, before all identity, before all separation, that I am the fundamental fact of existence, of consciousness, of being. God, the divine source, the monad, the one that you are and have always been. The complete activation protocol gives you a structure, a method, a way to approach this systematically. But ultimately, it all points to something that's available right now, in this moment, without any technique at all. What are you right now before you think about it? What's reading these words? What's aware of the reading? That's what you are. That's the monad. That's God recognizing itself through the form you call yourself. And when you rest as that, when you live from that, everything changes. Not because the world changes, but because your relationship to the world changes. You're no longer a fragment desperately trying to become whole. Your wholeness experiencing itself through apparent fragmentation. You're not separate seeking union, your union delighting in the play of apparent separation. This recognition is what the text calls salvation, liberation, awakening. Not a future achievement, a present recognition. And the practice, the breathing, the hand position, the phrase, all of it is just a way to create conditions for that recognition to occur, a way to train yourself to stop the activity that obscures it, a way to remember what you've forgotten. You don't need to believe anything I've said. You don't need to accept any theological framework or metaphysical system. You just need to practice. Try it. Do the 5 minutes daily for 30 days. Notice what happens. If it works, if you begin to experience the shifts we've described, continue. Let it deepen. Let it transform your life in whatever ways it naturally transforms. If it doesn't work, if after genuine, consistent practice you experience nothing useful, abandon it. Find another practice, another path, another way. The texts promise that everyone who persists will break through to monad recognition. I believe that based on my own experience and the experiences of those I've worked with. But you don't need to believe it. You can verify it yourself. That's the beauty of this work. It's not about faith, it's about direct experience. You can know for yourself whether what the texts promise is true. You can verify whether you are fundamentally the monad recognizing itself through biological form. And if you discover that you are, if you break through to that recognition even once, your life will never be the same. Not because you'll walk on water or perform miracles, but because you'll know at a level deeper than thought what you actually are. And that knowing will inform everything. The archonic programming will continue to run sometimes. Thought identification will reassert itself. You'll forget and remember and forget again. That's normal. That's the human experience. But underneath the forgetting, there will be a knowing, a recognition that can never be completely lost once it's occurred. A seed that, having sprouted, can never return to dormancy. And that seed will grow through your practice, through your life, through your experiences and relationships and challenges. It will grow until the monad consciousness is no longer something you access. Occasionally, it's what you are, continuously, consciously, delightfully. That's the promise. That's what "be still and know that I am God" points toward. Not some distant attainment, not some future state, but what you already are, right now, waiting to be recognized. So practice, be still, know, and discover what you've always been.